Most recent Toronto Life magazine is about to hit the stands, and you will see a picture of the mayor on the cover with the loneliest man in Toronto sitting beside him. And the cover article is written by Marci Mcdonald. It's called The Incredible Shrinking Mayor, and she's here with us now. Good morning.
Good morning.
A fascinating read, and it really reminded me of how steep this fall and how quickly this fall seems to have happened or be happening.
So quickly. What's interesting is I began this story, I hate to admit, last September. And during that time, there's been a total, almost narrative arc. It's like a novel. He was untouchable. At that point,
the Prime Minister seemed to be trying to curry favor.
Had just been at his mother's house in the backyard saying, you know, help us in the Ontario elections. He was the golden boy of Canadian politics. He had pulled off, helped Harper get the majority in the Toronto area, had pulled off this incredible landslide. All the councillors were in awe. They wouldn't dare challenge him. And in that time, my original deadline was in December, and it suddenly became clear to me that by then, the budget was to come down in January. There were all sorts of rumblings about labor disruptions. And I thought, no, I need more time. And in the few months after the beginning of the new year, everything changed. The public helped give councillors the backbone that they needed.
What happened to Ford Nation? You're saying the public, you know, he was always threatening to bring, you know, the might of Ford Nation against anyone who dared to go against him, and now his own council is going against him. You know, supporters generally within council are going against him. Why?
Well, Ford Nation is only about 35%. I think Nick Kouvalis, who is the campaign guru of Ford's, estimates that it's the solid core of 35% people of the population. So the rest of the population suddenly found they were losing their swimming pools in this budget, they were losing their late night bus routes, all of the services that people didn't think of as gravy, even if they voted for Rob Ford. The things that made Toronto great as a city, certainly livable, and they rose up in arms. And that's the sub-theme, really, of my story, is this rise of civic activism. And it took that in order to give councillors the backbone to dare challenge Ford and even discover that, say, in this agreement he had with the province about building nothing but subways, as he would call it, things had to go back to council. Council had a say. But council was not ready to take him on before.
Marci, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, I mean, the mayor hasn't behaved any differently than he has in years previous as councillor. He hasn't reneged on any promises. I mean, what was the turning point for people? Seeing that it's not as though the mayor they voted for changed in any way.
But I wonder if people really knew who they were voting for. By the time Ford got on the campaign trail, he was really programmed, media-wise, as far as he was known in the old council days for his incredible outbursts and rants as speeches, and he was then media trained with these 4 phrases: stop the gravy train, as you say, you know, cut the waste, clean up the mess at City Hall, which he was still saying after he was elected, as if he wasn't mayor over the mess.
Marci, does his style remind you, like his political style, smack of anyone else?
Well, the closest thing, this seems like a bizarre comparison, but I once did a personal interview with Ronald Reagan, and he was as handled as Rob Ford is.
But is he risking being as insulated as Richard Nixon?
Richard Nixon was a very, very smart man.
Right.
And he was his own chief strategist. I don't think you'd say that about Ford.
He's not holding himself up or anything like Nixon.
Who then would yield the most power in the mayor's inner circle then?
That was the running question for me all through my interviews, because I think when I began doing this story, it looked as if Doug Ford he was the man behind the Portland scheme, the Ferris wheel on the waterfront, and he seemed to be in every media opportunity. He's smiling, quoting, "We the Fords want," as if he was co-mayor. What surprised me was everyone agreed that it was not Doug Ford who was the co-mayor, It was a gentleman behind the scenes who had been around since the beginning of the Ford campaign called Marci. Not a public profile at all. He prefers to stay in the background, but he's trained in the Canadian military, and he's a firm believer in minimalist government. And that's where we see the real agenda of these budget cuts, that there is an aim, almost a crusade, to reduce the size and scope of government, which is their little phrase. But that means essentially getting government out of most public services that we as citizens may value, may want to keep.
It's not a family. I mean, it's turning into a bit of a dynasty. Doug Ford Sr., the father, was an MPP, and then Rob and Doug slowly in his footsteps started to get involved into politics. But when you step back and look at the history of this family, politics wouldn't necessarily have been the first thing that would have jumped to mind that they'd be entering into.
Not at all. In fact, Doug Ford was an MPP for only one term, and his seat was done away with in a redistribution. And he didn't actually make a huge mark as an MPP. Someone on council who sat with him in Mike Harris's caucus said he never said a word. So, but he was a personage in Etobicoke. He was a power broker, and he had a kind of force of personality. And the great boon for his son was that he had a seatmate, thanks to the alphabetical seating in the Ontario legislature, named Jim Flaherty, who's a very powerful man today. So we have this odd spectacle of a man who does not seem fully engaged in his mayoralty, but he has connections in very high places.
Right, we have to wrap it up, but I found it interesting too that you said the one time you sat with Rob Ford, he didn't look you in the eye?
Never once.
Never once. Interesting. The article is in the most recent edition of Toronto Life magazine, which is coming out now. It's called The Incredible Shrinking Mayor. Marci Mcdonald, thank you so much for being here this morning.
Thank you for having me.
Really interesting talking to you. It's coming up to 6:30.